Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Truman Library. I'm Kurt Graham, the director here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you out to what we know is going to be a very interesting and wonderful program. We're particularly pleased tonight as the Truman Library and the Truman Library Institute to be partnering with American Public Square and the Kansas City Star to bring you a great program about NATO, which of course is a topic that has not only strong Truman ties, but is near and dear to Truman and his legacy, and of course we're so delighted to be able to bring that discourse here to the heartland. It's wonderful to have these kinds of dialogues and understand the world then and the world now, and a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. So we're excited to have that. Very pleased to be here with American Public Square tonight. My friend Ambassador Katz is a visionary fellow who has put together, I think, a great programming model, and we're very honored and pleased to be partnering with him and with his organization. As you know, the American Public Square is housed at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And so to make further introduction, I'm going to turn it to Barbara Meyer, who is the UMKC Provost and Interim Chancellor. So she's a fairly busy woman, but we appreciate very much that she could be here with us tonight. So I'll turn it to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt, and good evening. I am Barb Meyer, and I serve as Interim Chancellor and Provost at UMKC, and I want to welcome you to the inaugural event in our programming for the Truman Series. It's a new partnership between American Public Square and the Truman Center at UMKC, the Truman Library, and the Truman Library Institute. We're so very proud to have American Public Square with UMKC and to support the informative and the innovative programs that it brings to Kansas City. Last year, when we approached Alan Katz about associating American Public Square with the Harry S. Truman Center at UMKC, we had really high hopes, and we are already seeing those being met just with tonight's program and the launch of the Truman Series. And this program tonight will be one of the three others that we'll have through March 2018. So I'd like to welcome tonight's panelists, who you'll meet momentarily, and I want to thank them for joining us here in Kansas City. I also want to thank our host tonight, the Truman Library and Museum. It's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful facility, and I don't know how you can't walk through here and just be incredibly inspired and be so proud to be a Kansas Citian. I'd like to thank the sponsors of tonight's program, the Charles Koch Institute, the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum, the Truman Library Institute, and the International Relations Council. And I want to also acknowledge American Public Square's partners, KCUR and the Kansas City Star. The Kansas City Star is live streaming tonight's program via their Facebook page, and that is facebook.com/Kansas City Star, all one word. If you're not here tonight, you can still submit a question for our panel via the Star. And we're also tweeting tonight at American Public Square, which is hashtag APSKC. So now I'd like to introduce Alan Katz. Alan is a proud UMKC alum. He's the former U.S. Ambassador to Portugal. He's a UMKC Distinguished Professor, and he's the founder of American Public Square. Please welcome Alan.
Barbara, thank you very much. I want to thank the Truman Library for hosting us here tonight, and to our sponsors and to our partners. We're really very happy to be in this remarkable facility and to celebrate and pay tribute to the legacy of President Truman. This new partnership between American Public Square and the Truman Library and Truman Library Institute celebrates the Truman connection to Kansas City and the Truman Center at UMKC. We're going to be presenting 4 programs that we believe are relevant to President Truman and his legacy. And tonight we begin with NATO, which, as you all know, came into existence during the Truman presidency. And next year the series will continue with the Affordable Care Act program on civility and politics, and our program mid-March on fake news. I hope you're going to join us for those programs as well as other American Public Square events. So I'm going to go over a couple of for those of you who've never been to one of our programs before, we go over quick ground rules here. If you look in your program, you're going to see something like this. You should have one. On one side it says question, on the other side it says fact check. If you have a question, write it down, pass it down to the end, and they'll be picked up by our volunteers. If you have a fact check, and what that means simply is this: if you think something you have heard is factually incorrect, write it down. It will be picked up and taken to our fact checkers. We have 2 roving reporters tonight who are going to be picking up your questions and fact checks. They are Marla Schulde. Marla, raise your hand. Thank you. And Chris Ann Cardiff. Where's Chris Ann? Over there on the other side. Okay. They're our roving reporters. They're going to be asking the questions that you submit. Or they'll be coming to you to ask the question yourself. What we are asking people, if you want to ask the question yourself, we would like you to ask the question as opposed to giving a testimonial. We also have tonight with the Kansas City Star Life Facebooking the program, we have Colleen Nelson and Mary Kay Metivier. Did I get that right? Close enough? Okay. Over here, raise your hands. They are from the Star. They have become our partners, and we are delighted to be able to work so closely with them. And they are going to be taking questions via Facebook, and we will be asking the panel the questions that they pick up. Tom Burns, where are you, Tom? Tom Burns right here. Didn't see you, sorry. He is our fact checker for tonight. And we have several of the audience who have civility bells. Who's got a civility bell? Raise your hand. Ring your bell. Okay, if you hear that civility bell, that means people have to stop talking because it means things are less than civil. And finally, we ask you not to, if you have something that you particularly agree with that you hear up here, please do not applaud. If you agree with it, you get to do this. If you disagree with it, go like this. We find that basically the program moves in a much smoother way if we don't have those interruptions. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this evening's program, Brian Ellison, who has served in this capacity many times for us. He's the host of KCUR political podcast State House Blend, Missouri, and regular host of Central Standard and Up to Date. He also contributes to KCUR news coverage, including reporting on Missouri politics, anchoring election night broadcasts, and hosting various live events in the community. An ordained Presbyterian minister, Brian is also the executive director of Covenant Network of Presbyterians. Now, before I bring Brian and the panel out here, there's one final thing that I'd like to point out. There will be something that will come near the end of the program, which Brian will explain to everyone, which we have added as a result of the suggestion of one of our members. And that member is Paul Russell. Paul, would you please stand up? Thank you very much, Paul, because I think everyone's going to like what you had to say. Okay. This is basically to demonstrate that we ask people for their ideas. If they're good ones, we actually take them. Without further ado, I'd like to present our moderator, Brian Ellison, and our panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Katz, and good evening, and welcome to all of you. It was 70-odd days ago that President Trump addressed the United Nations General Assembly. It was a speech in which he promised to always put, quote, America first, and said other countries should put their countries first, too. And in that speech, he quoted from another speech, one that President Truman delivered to Congress 70 years ago this month. The speech in which he asked Congress to fund the Marshall Plan. And Truman said in that speech, and this isn't the part that President Trump quoted, he said, "This joint undertaking of the United States and a group of European nations is proof that free men can effectively join together to defend their free institutions against totalitarian pressures and to promote better standards of life for all their peoples." The very next year, in 1948, Congress would fund the Marshall Plan for European recovery, and in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty would be signed, building on that foundation and beginning what we know now as NATO. The world, including the threats to North American and European democracies, the world is different today than it was then. President Trump and President Truman bring, shall we say, different perspectives to their foreign policy. But many of the questions are fundamentally the same today that faced the first signers of that North American treaty. What is it for? Who should be included? What responsibility should each nation bear financially, militarily? And in the United States, the question, as ever, remains, what is in this nation's interest when it comes to acting on the international stage? Tonight, we seek to ask and answer these and other questions about NATO from Truman to Trump. And we've assembled an esteemed and thoughtful group of conversation partners to inform our thinking. I invite you to welcome Ivo DAALDER, Barry Posen, Nina Jancowitz, and Stephen WALT. And Ambassador DAALDER, I'd like to start with you. No one else on this panel has seen the alliance as up close and personal as you have. You served as the American ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. So remind us of what you see from that unique perspective as the most important reason for NATO to exist, historically, through the Cold War, after 9/11, and even today.
And we have, what, 45
2 minutes,
for that?
yeah, right.
The fundamental reason then, throughout the Cold War, after the Cold War and today, for NATO, was a belief by Europeans, shared at the time by the Truman administration, that the United States needed to be involved, physically involved, in Europe. That the future of European security, the future of peace and stability on the continent required a permanent American engagement. It was the absence of the United States prior to World War I, and particularly in the interwar period, that helped produce 2 wars. And it has been the presence of the United States since 1945, encapsulated in this treaty that was signed on April 4, 1949, for the United States to be present physically in Europe, to be part of an alliance in which an attack against one will be regarded as an attack against all, which is the collective defense provision of NATO, that was fundamental to preserving peace and stability in Europe. And peace and stability in Europe was not only important for Europeans, it was important for the United States because our security required that there was peace and security in Europe, as we had demonstrated by the fact that we engaged in 2 world wars at extraordinary cost to the United States to achieve that. So that's what NATO was fundamentally about, and it continues to be fundamentally about that today.
So Dr. Posen, you are a distinguished scholar, an MIT professor, the author of many books and articles, and I think the titles of some of those writings capture pretty well your perspective. Your book from 2014 is called Restraint. Your paper in Foreign Affairs from 2013 called Pull Back. You've got a pretty long history of advocating for a smaller footprint for American foreign policy.
Not that long, surprisingly.
Okay, well, a medium-sized history of advocating for that. But NATO, one has to admit, has been sort of a foundational element of our international presence for generations. My question to you is, should the U.S. really be pulling back? Should it show restraint when it comes to NATO?
Well, I have a slightly different view of what NATO is about from Ivo. I come at this from an American national security vital interest point of view, and I think that the main reason why the Americans got involved in Europe after the Second World War was the great weakness of the European states shattered by war and the rise of the power of the Soviet Union. And we made a calculation that it would not be good for the United States if the remnants of the industrial power of Germany and France and Britain came under the control of the Soviet Union and could be organized in a way that could compete with the United States of America. That's the fundamental reason. That's the fundamental realist story for why we got involved in NATO. And my point is really a kind of a simple one, which is our work here is done, right? The European states are now wealthy, they're populous. Europe is layered over not only with the existing North Atlantic Treaty Organization institution, which is our favorite one, but they have their own institution, the European Union. The Soviet Union is no more. Russia is a shadow of what the Soviet Union was, right? And so my basic view is that the United States, which has many, many demands and claims on its resources, both domestic and foreign, has to look at all of its commitments with a cool eye and ask, where can those states whom we helped to recover begin to take on responsibility for their own security? And if that's not Europe, if that's not in many ways a crashing success for U.S. foreign and security policy, the dividends of which we should now begin to enjoy by being able to focus on other things, if it's not in Europe, then I think we need to have a kind of a serious conversation about what we've been doing.
All right. Well, I think we'll have one of those tonight. Dr. Jancowitz, you are
not
also...
Not a doctor. I'm
okay.
not gonna... That's all right, though.
Nina.
Yes.
You are also a scholar and author. You're a Kennan Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and you've worked at the State Department, you've worked overseas, and you've told me that NATO maybe isn't where you spend the majority of your time, but you do spend a lot of time focusing on Russia. And you know as well as anyone that the threat NATO was originally built to contain, against which it was a bulwark, the Soviet Union, is no more, and the Russia of today is not the Cold War era Soviet Union. So my question is Russia really enough of a threat to justify this massive operation that is NATO?
Well, thank you for that very good question, and thank you for having me. I want to let everyone know that I considered this invitation a very special one, mostly because of the civility bell. I think we need to have more civil conversations today in this country, so I applaud this effort, and I hope it continues. So getting back to your question about Russia, yes. In short, I think Russia is a threat that we need to be very concerned about. Yeah, it's a shadow of itself, as Barry said, of its former self, of the Soviet Union. But having recently been in the country of Georgia, whose flag is pictured on this second placard here, and having spent a year in Ukraine where 10,000 people have died at the hands of Russia, at the gates of Europe, yes, Russia is a threat. Russia is not run by rational actors as far as I'm concerned, and we've seen over the past couple years. And we need to strengthen our defenses against it. Certainly, you know, we had this discussion over the past 25 years that NATO in its new incarnation would not be a response to Russia, but times have changed. Lots of people are putting their lives on the line and indeed losing them. And to say to folks in Ukraine and Georgia that this fight is not worth our being a part of, I think is an insult to what they've done.
Let me turn to you, Dr. Waltz. You're a professor at the Kennedy School of Government. You've taught at Princeton, the University of Chicago. And you are no defender of President Trump or much of his performance as president, or maybe even as a human being. But you do.
I've never met the man.
All right. Well, I'll mention an article I just read that you wrote a little bit later. But you do seem to agree with him and disagree with Ms. Jancowitz about the danger that Russia poses to the United States. That is to say that you don't seem to think of it as such a serious danger to the U.S. If Russia remains a primary reason for America's investment in NATO, is it fair to say that you think that the case for it is overstated?
Yeah, I think that's right. That Russia is a problem in a number of areas. We have differences with them on a variety of issues. There are areas where we have cooperated with Russia in the past, and in fact, if we had not, along with the Russians, mismanaged that relationship, we would be, I think, cooperating today on matters like nuclear security in the areas of the former Soviet Union and elsewhere. But I do think there's been a tendency to assume that today's Russia is a sort of reincarnation of the bad old Soviet Union that did give NATO a real purpose. And just one indicator of that would be the fact that Russia, by the estimates of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, spends maybe $70 billion a year on its defense establishment. We, of course, spend over $600 billion, so it's hard to see how Russia is quite the same threat that the Soviet Union was. But moreover, if you look at the European members of NATO, not counting the United States, not counting Canada, they spend 3 to 4 times what Russia spends on defense every year. Now, they don't spend it very efficiently. They don't get nearly as much bang for the buck as they could if they were better organized. And of course, one of the reasons they're not particularly well organized is that the United States has always been the security provider of first and last resort. That made sense during the Cold War when there was a Soviet Union to deal with, as Barry already explained. But one does have to sort of ask a question of why a continent of roughly 500 million people, the population of the European Union, that has, I think, a $17 trillion combined economy, roughly the same size as the American economy, cannot deal with the possible challenge from Russia with, you know, $60 billion or so, $60 to $70 billion in defense spending, a population of only 140 million or so, by the way, rapidly aging population as well. And therefore, this is not something you would expect Europe to do overnight. You wouldn't say that the United States would want to be out of NATO by next Tuesday or anything like that. But moving to a very different, at least pattern or model for burden sharing seems to make infinite sense. And I would just comment one final point here is you'll notice that Nina did not talk about how we in America were threatened by Russia. She talked about how Georgians might be threatened by Russia or Ukrainians might be threatened by Russia. That's something we should think about, but it's not quite the same as saying that Kansans are threatened by Russia.
Well, let me pick up where you've taken us with regard to burden sharing, with regard to the balance of responsibility that the various participants in NATO ought to have. A lot of President Trump's expressed concern about NATO during the campaign and since he became president has been the perception that the U.S. is contributing a disproportionately large amount financially, militarily. I guess my question is, do you think he's right about that? Is that a fair observation, and is that a bad thing? Or is it okay that the U.S. is contributing more than its fair share?
The president has a misunderstanding of the process, which I'm sure Ivo could explain, but the basic concept is right. I mean, the United States at this point is spending 3.25–3.5% of its GDP on defense, right? The average across Europe is 1.5%. Now, Europeans are not poorer than Americans. Per capita GDPs in the larger European countries are not quite as high as ours, but they're pretty high. And you know, if you travel to Europe, you'll see that the people look prosperous and healthy. The streets are usually clean and wide, and they've got new infrastructure. It's a very prosperous, happy place, and in the large, quite democratic, right? So to sit here in the United States and talk about the great threats to Europe that the United States has to continue to organize military power about, when the Europeans themselves, who are fully capable of organizing military power, seem not to want to do it, this seems at variance with an ethical consideration of America's national interests and the interests of American citizens and American taxpayers. There ought, at minimum, the structure of the situation should be different. And many of our alliances work this way. We agree to defend our allies, and they agree to help, right? Now, our allies are pretty rich, and the thing should be turned around. Our allies should agree to defend themselves, and if it's in our interest, we should agree to help. And we can have a conversation about what are the many possible future patterns that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization could be organized by, but the idea that the Europeans should be carrying much, much heavier weight, to me, there's no rationality in that argument.
Ivo, do you accept that framework? The choice is between we defend them and they help, they defend themselves and we help?
Three observations. Number one, it's always good to take Europe and take all 29 countries, or 27 in the case of NATO, put them together, add them up, and say, look, they have that much as GDP and that many people, but they're 29 separate countries. And with that comes an inefficiency that is inherent in the nature of the enterprise. We can try to find ways to enhance the efficiency of cooperation, both within the European Union and within the NATO context, but there is a reality to having 27 countries being not as big as one country, and you can't compare those. They're a little apple and oranges. That's observation number one. Observation number two is, as I was walking briefly through the exhibit here, ran across a letter from Dean Acheson to President Truman, written in 1950 from Brussels, where he has a small group meeting with the 3 high commissioners in Germany, the French foreign minister, and the British foreign minister, about what? How Europe can contribute more to its defense. So we've been at this for a long time. The big debate then was how Germany could contribute to the defense. And the French in particular, were against rearming Germany. You know, having lived in France and gone through 40-44, understandable, and it took a while, and in fact it took some big threats by the United States, including the threat of a, quote, agonizing reappraisal, in the very way that we're talking now about reappraising our engagement, to get the French to accept German rearmament and indeed membership in NATO. And it was membership within NATO that allowed rearmament to proceed in the way that was necessary. So the debate about burden sharing is nothing new, nor is the kinds of threats that President Trump has issued since being president anything new. We had congressional legislation mandating the reduction of American troops if the Europeans didn't spend more on defense, the Nunn Amendment and other amendments. So we've been at this for a while. Third observation, I agree that the Europeans are not paying enough for their defense. And it is their defense. By the way, it's also our defense, because they also defend us. Europe sent 75,000 troops, including every single soldier in the Estonian army, every single one, to Afghanistan. Why did they do that? That wasn't about their defense. That was about the defense collectively, but in response to 9/11. So as an alliance, we are about helping each other. The balance has tilted for a very long time against Europe and in favor of the United States, or put it the other way around, against the United States and in favor of Europe, particularly on expenditures. And there is a rationale for getting Europe to pay more. Indeed, the Europeans have agreed to do so. They agreed in 2014, in part because of the actions that the Russians took. It's helpful to have threats when it comes to defense spending, to increase their defense spending to 2% of GDP, which, by the way, is where they were in the year 2000. It's only from 2000 to 2017 that the reductions have, or 2014 is going up. I think it should go much, much more rapidly. I think we can have a debate, and we should have a debate, about how to rebalance the bargain between American involvement versus European involvement. What I don't think makes sense from an American perspective is for the United States to say, actually, you're on your own, you're strong enough, you ought to be able to do this enough, and just you figure it out. Because some Europeans may not make the choices we would like them to make. They may, in fact, align or hedge with the Russians and break apart the agreement that now exists to be united. So we need to be careful about how we change that balance, but we should have a debate about it. And one of the salutary effects of having Donald Trump expressing this in the way that he expresses it, even though the underlying rationale is, may be questionable, is that at least we are now having a conversation in the public and in Europe about the need to rebalance the bargain and the various efforts that Europe versus the United States is making on defense.
Jump in there, Steve?
I just very quickly, I think there's a lot of truth in what Ivo just said, but notice the lesson of all of those historical episodes. He's absolutely right that burden sharing has been an issue in the alliance since its formation. But of course, the various moments where the United States was actually able to get the Europeans to do a little bit more, in the 1970s, after the threat to withdraw American troops, more recently, in response now to some of the things President Trump has said, it's basically only when the United States threatens to do a lot less do you then get some modest European responses. And then whenever the United States then does respond, Europe reverts back. And why shouldn't they? Right? If the United States is willing to be the main shield protecting Europe from whatever external threats it might face. If you were a European, why not save that money, not worry about military issues very seriously, and spend it on yourselves in other ways? So, I mean, I think there's a lesson in that history, and that's the only way we are going to get a fairer distribution of burdens here is for the United States to play real hardball.
And so I'm not against that, and I have the bruises to show the hardball on trying to do that. It does help in making that argument if the Russians behave in the particular way they've been behaving since 2014. And in fact, it isn't Donald Trump that changed the dynamic. It's Russia that did. And it was part of the alliance coming together. But that said, I do think there is a reason for the United States to say A2. So let's take the A2. It is not the United States that is the only one that is deploying troops in the Baltic states. In fact, it's the Germans who have an entire battalion with other NATO members in Lithuania. It's the Canadians in Estonia, and it's the Brits in Latvia. That's good. That's what we want. That's what an alliance is about. The idea that the United States is the only one providing defense for Europe discounts the very numbers that, Steve, that you mentioned, which is that they're a significant military force, and they're providing real capabilities to that effort. They should provide more capabilities, not so we can do less, because frankly, our cuts in defense spending in Europe have been far larger than the European cuts.
Even that's not exactly right.
Well, it is.
I think the German military has cut itself as much as the American military in Europe has cut itself.
No, that's not true.
Yes, I think they're at about 1/7 of their former strength, and we're at about 1/7 of our former strength.
We've got people who
I
can
checked
look
it
into that.
last night. They can go look, right? The German military is pitifully small now.
The German military.
They're down to 1.15% of GDP spent on defense. This was an army that at the peak of the Cold War could put 1 million men in the field in 96 hours, could put 5,000 tanks in the field in 96 hours. And if the German army could scrape together 200 tanks today, it would be a miracle. And yes, they have a battalion, they're the lead element of one battalion in one Baltic state. But what's all those battalions are all symbolic. What those battalions are meant to symbolize is real combat power. And we need the Allies to pony up and generate real combat power. And even the increases that the Germans are currently committed to and the French are nominally committed to, these are not sufficient. They're not even close.
Well, the increase is to 2% of GDP, which is
the Germans are not on any kind of glide path to get to 2% of GDP.
But I think the interesting point that you made there is not about spending, but about readiness. And if we want to have a really productive conversation about whether we can actually be a deterrent in Europe, I think we need to talk about readiness and not some arbitrary number that has been decided many years ago. I mean, you're right. Germany is in pitiful shape right now. Even the UK, I read an article recently, would have a hard time deploying anyone within 72 hours. So maybe that's the conversation that we need to have. I don't think anyone here disagrees that Europe should take on a greater share of the burden. Getting back to your question, Steve, before about why Kansans should care about NATO or what's going on even...
Or Missourians as well.
Yes.
Right? Okay, just checking.
No harm done. And I will have you know I've been singing all day, Everything's Up to Date in Kansas City from Oklahoma. So, so why should you care? I'll give the same question, same answer I gave to a similar question that Secretary Tillerson asked, reportedly in private, about why U.S. taxpayers should care about what's going on in Ukraine. And it's a question of shared values, which Ivo was talking about before. This isn't just about defense. It's not just about deterring the Russians or keeping us safe from a military threat. Yes, NATO is primarily a military alliance, but it's also a community of democratic states of shared values, and we need to stand up for these worldwide. I wholeheartedly believe in that.
Okay, well let's tackle that part of this question then. As you say, the founding principles of NATO identify it as a community of democracies, and if you go to their website today, it says very clearly they have two functions: political and military. And we've been talking pretty exclusively about the military function of NATO, but it has always said that it exists to promote democratic values as well as use collective defense and military power. Let me ask, how well do each of you think NATO has embodied this first function of promoting democracy, apart from its military alliance purpose. And doesn't that still seem like a good and important thing in the world?
Can I jump in first because I
Please.
brought it up?
Please.
So although I wholeheartedly believe in this, I think NATO has not done a very good job of this to this point. For nations like Poland and the Baltic states, NATO was a huge democratizing force in their membership action plans, the things that they had to do, including creating a fully volunteer military. You know, these are democratizing effects on a country that's coming out of communism. That being said, there have been several instances in NATO's history, particularly with Greece and Turkey, and including right now Turkey, Poland, and Hungary, where we're seeing some serious democratic backsliding, and NATO really has no mechanism to enforce that community of democracies from continuing. So as we're reimagining NATO, this is something I'd like more people to think about. What mechanisms does it offer us to maintain kind of this political status quo, democratic nation building throughout Europe?
Do we have an answer to that?
The United States is not very good at building democracies when it goes alone. And it's not clear to me that NATO has been so committed to this democratic idea. During the heyday of the Cold War, Portugal wasn't a democracy, NATO member. Greece lapsed from democracy, remained a NATO member. Turks constantly going back and forth into military juntas, basically not a democracy. More recently, Turkey drifting away from democracy. Poland being chastised by the European Union for drifting away from democracy. And by the way, the European Union also uses conditionality to get people to enter, but once countries are under the transom, if they've passed the test to get into NATO and to get into the EU, it's much harder to expel them, and they can, you know, recidivate, which is what happens. So you know, our skills at this democracy promotion game are not, they're not very well developed, and I don't think we've been very successful. And partly, I just think that it's, you know, I don't want to blame the alliance or any one person. I just think it's really hard to bring democracy to a place that isn't democratic, right? I mean, we have whole schools in political science trying to figure out, you know, why does democracy happen? You can come up with like weird correlations, like you hit a certain per capita GDP, democracy becomes much more likely. But this is a correlation. I mean, what's the cause? It's years of history to develop a functioning liberal democracy.
Well, I mean, that's a pretty bleak assessment, Ivo, of the work of NATO.
I'm a bleak guy.
That's why we invite Barry. Number one, it's not the role of NATO to promote democracy. That's not part of its charter. It's not part of its essence. It is, however, a community of values, and it tries to be that, and it tries to be that with its own members, and it would like to have others who might become members to be part of it. I think it has a very mixed record, and it has a real problem. I mean, Turkey is a real issue. There is no mechanism to chastise, let alone remove a member from the alliance. Worse, because the alliance works by consensus. One country can completely muck up the system. One of the things the Turks have been very good at, even when they didn't have democratic problems, is to muck up the system, by the way. Yes. I spent a lot more time talking to my Turkish colleague in the 4 years plus that I was at NATO than to any other single person, because somehow the Europeans thought that it was the United States' obligation to make sure that Turkey always went along with where we are. I pity my successors who have to deal with Turkey today. But the Turks, because you work with consensus, nothing, literally nothing, can get done in the system if one country opposes it. So that is a real problem for the alliance. And it's a real problem when you try to put too many things into the equation, including talking about your backsliding democratically, et cetera. There may be another mechanism to do that, whether it's the European Union, Turkey's not a member, or some other mechanism. That said, 70 years of working together, and in fact, a large number of years in political opposition to another ideology has created a value and a unity and a community to the members of NATO that is different than existed in 1949. And it is worth preserving. And indeed, it's worth extending. And having other countries in Europe who were under the heel of the Soviet Union for many, many years become part of that democratic club of nations. However imperfect that club and that effort may have been, is overall a good thing. It's a good thing for the people who live there, and it's a good thing for the other members of NATO, including for people in Kansas and Missouri.
Are you starting a conversation about NATO enlargement? Because if that's, I mean, is that the conversation we're in now?
Would you like to have that conversation, Barry? We will have that conversation, and then we will turn to questions from the audience. So I'll give a little heads up that we'll go there in just a minute. But you're asking about expansion of NATO. That's a topic that's much discussed. NATO's been expanding ever since it was founded throughout the Cold War. It added countries. Spain joined in 1982. After the fall of the Soviet Union, many other countries joined. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic. We've got Central and Eastern European countries more recently. Just 6 months ago, Montenegro joined the alliance. There are 3 countries currently on the list of interested countries: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Macedonia. They want to become part of NATO. Would it represent positive progress for NATO to continue to expand?
No.
No.
Steve?
Yeah.
It would not represent positive progress.
Well,
right? Now Steve can explain why.
Okay.
I bet you both
I'll do my
can.
best. I mean, so first of all, I want to just indicate a point of agreement with Ivo that NATO's fundamental purpose was not democracy promotion. There was always a lot of rhetoric attached to that. You can't do anything in American foreign policy without saying it's also good for democracy and democratic values and human rights. But that wasn't the fundamental purpose, because what people should not forget is that an alliance of this sort, it does involve a sacred commitment that you're willing to send your sons and daughters to fight and die somewhere else. Right? That's what you're promising to do. And one of the reasons several of us up here thought NATO expansion was a bad idea, and certainly beyond the first 3 countries that were brought in, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, was we were taking on more and more obligations to defend, send our sons and daughters to fight and die if necessary, a growing number of countries that were very hard to defend, at least and offered very little military capability. So they didn't make the alliance stronger. I have nothing against Estonia at all, but Estonia has very little military capability. It's very hard to defend, and we just took on, when it entered the alliance, we took on the need to protect them. Moreover, as we are starting to learn now, moving those countries, moving NATO eastward was bringing in countries whose democratic roots were very shallow. And I think the reversion you're seeing in Poland, and even more deeply, I think, in Hungary, suggests this. What we were told back in the 1990s was that as more and more countries enter this, they'll learn about democracy, they'll be part of these institutions, democracy will spread, and because democracies won't fight each other, we'll never have any security problems. NATO expansion was sort of like an oil slick that was going to spread, and everywhere it spread, the world would become peaceful and tranquil. That does not appear to have been the case. And then finally, and most importantly, this gets us back to where we started, we forgot that Russia was there, and that the expansion of NATO, no matter how often we said it was not a threat to Russia, was not going to be viewed that way by Russians. And the closer we got to Russia, the more leverage they might have to do something about it. So I'm not going to defend any of the things Russia has done in Georgia or Ukraine or wherever, but it shouldn't have surprised us that once Russia got off the mat it was in, right, the state it was in the 1990s, it was going to do various things to cause this project to grind to a halt, which is in fact exactly what Russia did do. And if you think that's odd, I'll just remind everybody that the United States, when there was a revolution in Nicaragua and a dictator that was pro-American got overthrown by the Sandinistas, the United States organized a rebel army to challenge the Sandinistas back in the 1980s. Now, that was a tiny little country in Central America of no strategic importance really whatsoever. And we, the mighty United States, were really upset by that. If we could do that in the 1980s, is it all that surprising that when we started talking about bringing Ukraine, formerly part of the Soviet Union, a country of 40 million people, through which Russia has been invaded several times, is it surprising that Putin did what he did to try and derail that? Again, I am not justifying it, but I'm saying we should have thought that that might happen.
Okay, so let me, Nina has, through her head shaking and sighing, indicated she disagrees.
Okay, yes, a few things. First of all, I would push back very strongly on the notion that Poland has shallow democratic roots. It had the second constitution after ours in the world, and not only that, what's going on politically in Poland right now is, I would say, an entirely partisan battle, not unlike the one that we are seeing right now, and that does not mean that we have shallow democratic roots. That's the first thing. Also, going back to Ivo's point before, Poland is another state that has contributed a lot to American defense in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think that in that investment, we have seen dividends. In terms of Ukraine, the Ukraine issue that happened was not about NATO enlargement. I mean, I think you would argue that it was Georgia maybe was about NATO enlargement. It was about the EU and Ukraine and an association agreement. Ukraine is and has always been pretty far from a membership action plan.
Well, we, the United States, had proposed Ukraine for NATO membership. The Germans and the French vetoed it, but we had never taken that off the table. If you're sitting in Moscow and the leader of the alliance is proposing Ukraine, and the accession agreement with the EU had a security component to it as well.
I think that's stretching the facts. The people came out on the square because of the EU association agreement not getting signed by Yanukovych. And what happened was a popular protest that the Russians then took advantage of while the world was looking the other way. And it invaded sovereign territory, which I don't think is defensible if you're going to talk about.
I didn't try to defend it. I was trying to explain it. Right?
But I don't think I don't see them as related. That was a European issue, in my opinion, and having lived in Ukraine.
And the American Assistant Secretary of State was intimately involved in trying to arrange the selection of the Ukrainian leader.
Okay, well
Yats is the guy. And again, you have to look at this from a Russian perspective. Does this look to a reasonable Russian, I don't mean a paranoid Russian, a reasonable Russian, as someone, gee, it looks like the United States is trying to do regime change in Ukraine, a country right next door, thousands of miles from the United States, right next door to us. It doesn't have to be right, but it could certainly explain Russian behavior. And here's a case of American policy and European policy actually making Europe less stable, less safe, and giving us the problems we're facing there today.
That doesn't discount the fact that the Ukrainian people were the ones that went out on the square demanding that an association agreement that they supported wholly get fulfilled. And I don't think Victoria Nuland or anyone else has anything to do with that. That was democracy at work. It didn't have anything to do with NATO. Anyway, we can move on now.
No, I appreciate that conversation.
Can I get
Ivo, go ahead.
On the NATO enlargement track, because I'm a middle of the roader on this argument, and in two ways. I think the first time we enlarged NATO to 3 countries that you said, by the way, you thought was understandable, except that 2 of those countries are having some problems with their democracies. We had a very serious debate in the United States. We had a very serious debate in the Senate about that solemn commitment. Is this something that is both right? Does it make sense? Are we willing to defend them? What would it take, et cetera? And that was the right thing to do, because when you take a country into an alliance, you should have a serious debate about it, for exactly the reason that Steve pointed out. Subsequent enlargements, particularly 2004, which was the big bang when we brought in the 3 Baltic states and 4 others, didn't have that debate in the United States, nor, frankly, that much within Europe. And that was a major mistake. And so much so that when I became ambassador and walked in Brussels, I asked from one of the first things that I wanted to see were the contingency plans for defending the Baltic states. We didn't have any contingency plans to defend the Baltic states. I was told that the reason we didn't have any contingency plans is because the Germans didn't want it. So I went to the German ambassador and said, you know, we defended you guys as part of NATO for 60 years, and we now have the Baltic states as members of NATO. Don't you think we should have contingency plans for defending the Balts? And the ambassador said, yeah, of course we should. So we actually started the process to get contingency plans. We had in our alliance for 5 years 3 countries for which we had no contingency plans. We now do, by the way. Good thing. I think the next steps on enlargement, on Ukraine and Georgia in particular, I'm on record as being against it at the time and continue to be against it, in part for the reasons that you mentioned. There are sensitivities. There are sensitivities in the Baltics we can talk about too. We never recognized as the United States the incorporation of the Baltic states in the Soviet Union. That makes them different than Ukraine, in my view, from a legal and a whole variety of other standpoints. But Ukraine and Georgia, in Ukraine, there's always been 50-50 in favor of NATO enlargement. I don't want a country that does only want to be 50% part of NATO. I want a country that wants to be 100% part of NATO, or at least 80%. The Georgians, by the way, are very strongly in favor of NATO. The problem is that Georgia, as a country, doesn't border any other NATO country, which is really hard to defend a country that doesn't border a NATO country. Mm-hmm. So unless you bring in Russia or other Caucasus states that in between Georgia and Turkey, you're not going to be able to do that. So yes, this is a serious discussion that deserves and became less serious in the 2000s. Montenegro, frankly, was brought in for one reason only, to demonstrate that we could enlarge NATO to the Russians. I don't think that's a good enough reason in and of itself. So I think we've lost part of the seriousness with which we need to address the alliance. And as a result, we've had debates that of the kind that you see here that I think has lost the potency. We can then debate, should we or should we not have Slovakia or Estonia or not into the...
Brian,
Well,
Brian,
go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Just I want to get one other issue, perhaps that we'll get questions on this. The other thing that can't be forgotten in this broader conversation is that the United States does not have infinite resources. Most of us, I think, believe the United States has enormous needs here at home, things that have to be addressed, whether it's the health of the population, whether it's a burgeoning deficit, whether it's infrastructure, whatever. Second, and I would say equally important, is a set of strategic challenges in other parts of the world, right? And every dollar that the United States devotes to protecting its wealthy European partners is a dollar we can't spend, for example, trying to be in a stronger position in Asia, where we have a rising China that is almost certainly going to be a peer competitor for many decades to come, far more significant than Russia, far greater potential danger, far more ambitious at this point in wanting to restructure different aspects of international politics in ways we might find at least uncomfortable. Maybe not an absolute peril, but at least uncomfortable. And finally, of course, every moment that a president and his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense and Cabinet worry about European affairs is time that they're not spending worrying about other areas. Now, people can reach different conclusions about what areas deserve the greatest attention, the greatest priority, which are under the greatest challenge. But one of the things that at least motivates me is the sense that our bigger strategic challenges lie elsewhere. As Barry said at the beginning, Europe is ultimately actually a great success story. And because it's a great success story, we can devote more of our attention to other parts of the world where our interests may actually be under greater threat. And when I say our interests, I mean that of the United States.
So I think we probably will talk about some of those other areas, but I do want to get to some of the questions from our audience. I know they've been gathering those questions. Where's our first? Over here.
Hi, thank you. This first goes back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, and a couple of audience members had the same track of thinking, so we combined this into a two-part question. And our audience members are shy, so they didn't tell us their names. So does the $60 to $70 billion Russia spends on defense include cyber warfare spending? And knowing that that probably is a part of their agenda, the next war is likely cyber. What are NATO's focus and capabilities to combat cyber warfare, including disinformation campaigns?
Well, this happens to be Nina's area of expertise.
Perfect.
Okay, so that's
Did you plant that question?
No,
Nina?
but
Okay.
thank you to multiple of you who asked it. It's a great question and certainly very germane to our current situation here in the States. We have no idea how much Russia spends on its cyber operations, and that's for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which is that Russia employs, there's a very fine line between who works for the government and who is actually a criminal hacker. Russia likes to keep those people on its payroll. So we don't know. A lot of that is very classified within the intelligence service. In fact, some of the folks who were behind the hacks that happened in our election are in Russia's GRU, which is famously impenetrable. Related to disinformation, again, that question is very murky, but I would like to point out that although we don't know how much Russia spends on these things, NATO, I think, is doing a pretty good job. I would rate it as like a B plus job of responding to these hybrid threats, as they're now being called, which we saw play out in Ukraine. They're watching these things. There are a couple of centers of excellence, one of which is a cyber center of excellence in Estonia, established after Estonia was attacked by Russia for a long story, but moving a Soviet statue out of town. They were the first NATO victim of cyber attacks, and since then, over the past 10 years, NATO has been thinking a lot about whether a cyber attack should trigger Article 5. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ivo, I believe they decided no, it does not. There's no reciprocal cyber attack. But there's also now in addition to the Cyber Center of Excellence, there is a Stratcom Center of Excellence in Latvia and a Hybrid Threat Center of Excellence in Finland, which they're working together with the EU. And these are just centers where member states can nominate folks to go from their militaries, from their bureaucracies, to go and study these things, respond, and think up policy solutions for NATO. And they're very much on the forefront of this. I've been to a lot of conferences about disinformation in Europe and elsewhere, and not only do I think they have recognized the threat much sooner than many individual NATO member states have at a national level, but the military command structure of NATO in some ways, although it can be very frustrating in others, is uniquely suited to respond to this threat. So I have a positive outlook in terms of how NATO responds to cyber and disinformation.
You mentioned Article 5. Of course, that's the article that triggers the collective defense by the alliance. Do others see that differently? That is cybersecurity not an important contribution that NATO is making? Ivo?
Well, two comments on this. One, I think it is important for us to recognize that what the Russians engaged in was an attack. It may not have been an armed attack, but it was an attack. It was an attack on our country, and they have attacked other countries with cyber weapons by directly interfering into our elections. It's a very serious thing. We should take it seriously, and we need to find ways to defend our own systems and ourselves against this kind of attack. NATO, frankly, is late to that game, as indeed we are individually as countries. But there are two things that NATO has done that are important. First, it has now formally recognized that depending on the damage that the cyber attack, the damage of the cyber attack, it is possible to regard an attack as an armed attack and therefore trigger the collective defense provision of Article 5. It's a political decision to do so. It's always a political decision, but it is now possible to do so. You can, for example, think about an attack on your electoral system that leads to the breakdown of hospital and healthcare and nuclear and power plants and whatever that can have massive consequences and casualties, and that would then could be considered as an armed attack. Secondly, so it's an important conceptual shift that NATO has taken, as the U.S. government and the U.S. has taken as well. Secondly, the ability to coordinate effective countermeasures in cyber defense requires an agreement to be engaged in counter cyber operations. The best defense in cyber defense involves offense. You have to be in the computer systems of the other side to understand where the attack is coming from and indeed to prevent it at an early enough stage. There has been a debate within NATO, and there will continue to be a debate within NATO, whether this is something that NATO as an organization should be involved in. It gets pretty tricky, it gets pretty classified, it gets pretty hard to have a serious conversation in a public forum, but also in a forum of 29 countries. How much do you want to share on those kinds of things?
But what do
makes
you
it very hard.
Should
I think the United States has certain capabilities that very few other countries have. And the question is, would you want those capabilities shared with other countries, even if they are your allies? And I think you want to think long and hard before you do that in certain cases. And in fact, we do think long and hard over that. We have never shared the decision on using nuclear weapons with our allies, for good reason, because it's a decision that only the President of the United States should be able to make. Maybe more people than the President of the United States should be able to make. But not necessarily our allies.
But you are right. Right now, it is the President of the United States.
I am right.
Yes.
And we want to keep it that way. So this is a new realm, at least on, well, anyway. At least when you talk about other countries.
Yes.
I think you want to be careful about it.
But it's very difficult for those of us living our normal lives, even those of us who study these things all the time, to have a good feel for the cyber issue, right? But one thing you should know, I mean, the United States for the last 8 or 10 years has declassified the intelligence budget every year. The American intelligence budget is the top line. How it's spent is not declassified, but the top line is declassified. And the United States spends about $70 billion a year on intelligence. About $20 billion of that goes to direct support of the military, and about $50 billion just goes to intelligence, which includes counterintelligence, which includes penetration of other people's systems, which includes all the things that allow us to listen in on other people's systems, gather information, process it, break codes, et cetera, et cetera. We have in this country a massive effort, right? That effort probably exceeds the defense budget of even the largest European country. Now, if we have a problem with cybersecurity, we should be finding a way to ask how it is that the IC manages to spend all that money and still not deliver the kind of opposition to Russian penetration that we, I think, have a right to expect. In fact, the kind of opposition to criminal penetration that we have a right to expect, right? Now, the problem seems to be that they love to penetrate, and they like to bank their penetrations and not use them on a day-to-day basis to deal with the day-to-day problems that the Russians create. They're waiting for the big one. They're holding assets for the big one. Well, while we're holding assets for the big one, there's this series of little ones that we're not doing too well at. And this whole problem requires some kind of scrutiny, but because it's all behind this veil of classification, it is really, really hard to get at.
Brian? Just a footnote to this issue, and I'm not a cyber expert, but it's worth at least pondering what the actual nature of the problem is that we're getting from overseas. And it may be the more esoteric forms of cyber penetration and attacks of various kinds, hacking, say the Democratic National Committee computers and stuff like that. But we're also now learning that some of what was going on in the 2016 election was not high tech really at all. It was involving, news bots and putting up fake news on Facebook, creating artificial identities from overseas. That didn't require enormous cyber sophistication. It just required understanding that Facebook was a vulnerable platform to that kind of thing, and you might be able, if you were smart and clever about how you did it, you might be able to shape the opinions of Americans in ways where they didn't really know that their opinions were being shaped in that way. That's, to me, is a slightly different problem. It is still a problem, but it's a problem having to do with the way social media is organized, regulated here in the United States. We left ourselves at least potentially vulnerable in that particular regard. I'll just add one final point, is I don't know, and I'm not sure anybody knows, to what extent the outcome of the 2016 election is a function of really aggressive Russian hacking, use of Facebook, the fact that Breitbart exists, the fact that the Democrats didn't nominate the greatest candidate in the world, et cetera. Parsing out who's responsible for that level of interference or the results of our elections is a very tricky matter. And I'll just say part of it, to the extent that we were affected from abroad, it was in part because we were vulnerable to be affected abroad, and not just in a technical sense.
Sure. Let me give Nina a final word about disinformation.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for bringing that up, Steve. In terms of disinformation, maybe being a slightly different animal, and I think you're absolutely right. One of the points that I always make is that we left ourselves vulnerable, not only because of the way social media works, but because media literacy and critical thinking have kind of become less of a priority in our school systems and things like that. So these are issues that NATO cannot get involved in. This is not NATO's terrain, but they are thinking about the greater strategic narrative of what NATO means in Europe, as are the Europeans, and that's another question of how to push back.
Perhaps a good topic for another American Public Square event in the future. Let's take a question from over here.
All right, I gotta tell you, one of the fun things about going through these questions is if we wait long enough, our brilliant panel answers a lot of them. But we do have a few that are still fresh, I think, or kind of coming along the lines of some of the things that you guys have already said. This question is, it's two-part, but they're short. Would our defense spending be less if we contributed less to NATO? And are our military bases in Europe more beneficial to Europe or more beneficial to us?
These are good questions.
Good questions. Let's start with the first one about spending. If we reduced our contributions to NATO, would we necessarily spend less on defense?
You can't tell how the DOD and the Congress are going to sort matters. And it's a funny quality of the American defense budget today that it's quite hard to pin down which forces and which dollars are for which things. People who want to argue that a particular commitment is cheap tend to only want to try and count the short-term costs of the number of forward deployed units in that particular region. And that's clearly preposterous because the purpose of those units is to serve a base for American forces from the United States to fall in on, right? So coming back to a point that Nina made earlier, you have to look at the campaigns in question and ask, what things are you holding in the United States that are basically a reserve largely for this problem? And that's going to be a contentious matter in the United States, right? It just is. So if someone, including me, told you that I know exactly how much money we can save, particularly by giving up the NATO commitment, they probably don't know because the Pentagon accounting wouldn't permit you to calculate it anyway. But also you're making some predictions about how the whole defense politics policy debate will play out in the United States. That said, right, it would be a peculiar thing if a commitment as big as that one, once it was attenuated, had no effect on your overall defense spending. It would be a peculiar thing if that was the case, because that would imply that the defense of Europe is somehow free, and of course it isn't free. It costs something, right? We're dedicating something to that problem.
Can I,
please?
So I agree with Barry on the analysis on both the uncertainty and the fact that if you were to remove the American commitment to Europe, it should lead to a reduction in defense spending or a reallocation of defense spending to other areas. So I think that's clear. a point about our public debate, in part because of the way our president has been talking about this issue. So he has publicly proclaimed in a number of cases that Europe, quote, owes the United States over $1 billion. And he has, in his interactions with the German chancellor, both privately and publicly, that is on Twitter, which I think is public, and I don't think it was a bot. I think this was Donald Trump.
You should always assume that Twitter is public.
Yeah.
Forever.
Even when you're direct messaging. Told the Germans, and in fact, Germany owes the United States $1 billion. The United States spending on defense is a decision that the United States makes. And we can debate whether it's the right or wrong decision, but it's a decision that the United States makes. Europeans don't owe the United States anything when it comes to money. What they owe as an ally is to do their fair share in defense. But doing their fair share doesn't mean that they pay us. We are not in Europe as mercenaries for Europeans. We're in Europe because we think it is important to our security. We can, again, which is what we're doing here, debate the extent to which we should do that. But the idea that somehow the United States should be paid by Europeans to provide for their defense is not only not how it works, but actually is a undermining of our conception of what it is that we're trying to do. We are where we are because we think that's the right thing. If we don't think it's the right thing, then we shouldn't be there, which gets to the issue of bases. All of the bases in Europe, number one, are paid for by the Europeans. Indeed, the largest military base in the world has just opened up in South Korea and is paid 95% by South Koreans. So the basing infrastructure that exists around the world over time is both paid for and maintained by the host country. It's called host nation support. Number one. Number two, we have, for the last 20 plus years, and certainly since 9/11, used our bases in Europe to deploy to other regions, primarily Afghanistan and Iraq, and use the infrastructure that exists in Italy, in Germany in particular, as a means to forward deploy and deploy from to other places. Indeed, every single wounded soldier, Marine, airman, and naval officer in these theaters comes to Frankfurt for treatment. So there is an infrastructure abroad that is beneficial, not just for the defense of Europe, it's very beneficial to the defense of Europe, and I shouldn't undermine, I wouldn't suggest otherwise, but that is paid for by our allies and makes it possible for us at a much cheaper and much more effective way to deploy elsewhere. Again, we can have a debate whether we need those forces in those particular places to be deployed from Europe or we should deploy them from something else. Valid debate. But when we think about the infrastructure that exists, that has grown on over time, it's not just that we are in Europe to protect Europe. We're in Europe, one, to protect the United States, but two, also to use those capabilities to be forward deployed in other places, naval, air, and land forces.
Yeah, but just to reiterate what Ivo said, right, I place a lower value on those bases in Europe because I place a lower value on the other things that the United States is doing in other places around the world, for which we sometimes use our European bases as gas stations or hospitals, right? Because I want to do less of those other things, I place a lower value on their ancillary benefit as a gas station and a hospital for those contingencies in the Middle East or the Persian Gulf or other places, because I consider many of those contingencies to be mistaken as well, right? So I'm not just having questions about the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations. You know, in my own work, I have questions about many American commitments.
Well, let's talk about some of those other places, some that you've mentioned and some that we haven't mentioned yet. Okay, Russia may not be as significant a threat as the Soviet Union once was, but there are other threats that have come to the fore that seem to be deserving more attention. Even just in today's news, the Middle East comes to mind as a place that is less stable than we might like it to be. China, of course, is a global economic rising superpower, and there is concern about the military threat there at some point in the future as well. Can NATO be a force in addressing these issues, or is our continued engagement with NATO hampering our ability to respond strategically to other challenges as they arise? Steve?
Yeah, I'll take a whack at that. I mean, I guess I want to start with a sort of very big picture answer to that, just to remind everybody that the United States, despite the fact that we worry about lots of things in lots of places around the world, is still a remarkably secure country. There's no other great power in history that has been as secure as the United States is, even allowing for cyber weapons, even allowing for intercontinental ballistic missiles. Those two big oceans are still a remarkable source of protection against various things. We don't have the refugee problem, for example, that Europe has faced, because the Atlantic Ocean is a lot bigger than the Mediterranean, and that insulates us to some degree. We have no great powers nearby. We don't have to worry about being invaded in any particular way. And terrorism, although it's the thing we've obsessed about, is in fact a relatively minor threat. I don't want to dismiss it entirely. Obviously, 9/11 was a horrible event. There have been subsequent attacks, but of course far more Americans die on the highway or are killed by guns in the United States by Americans in non-terrorist incidents than have been killed by terrorists. And again, that's partly because we're not located, say, in the Middle East or in those areas. So we are a remarkably secure country, and that means we really only have to worry a lot about equally powerful countries emerging in different parts of the world. That's why we fought against Nazi Germany. That's why we fought against Wilhelmine Germany. That's why we tried to contain the Soviet Union and did so successfully for 40 or 50 years. And in my judgment, that's why over the years we're going to worry more and more about China, because Germany's not a dominant world power any longer. Russia is never going to be a dominant world power again. It's a power in decline, as President Obama said. But China is a rising power, and one that I think we're going to find ourselves in a pretty stiff competition with. Well, if that's the case, then you want to think carefully about how you invest your resources, how you invest the president's time, how you deploy diplomats, how you do various alliance structures. To me, our alliances in Asia are far more important to our long-term security now than our alliances in Europe, which is not to say that partners in Europe are not helpful on counterterrorism, as they are, and could continue to be even if NATO didn't exist. There's no reason why the United States couldn't cooperate with other countries on counterterrorism, because we do that with other countries who aren't in NATO. So that is a way it could contribute, but it doesn't require being in the alliance as well. My point being is, I think we do have to allocate resources appropriately, and dealing with those non-European contingencies well, I'll add one other point. Yes, NATO has been involved in a number of these activities, whether it's the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, some, not a NATO role, but some help from some of our NATO partners in Iraq, and then finally in Afghanistan. And I think Barry and I probably agree on this. Neither of those things went particularly well. Iraq was a huge blunder. Libya was a well-intentioned mistake, and Afghanistan has gone on far longer than it should have. So to the extent that our allies either helped get us into those or helped us with them, to me does not mean all that much. And if the long-term future challenge for the United States is really China, I believe NATO will have almost no role to play in that whatsoever. If we go to our NATO partners and say, we have a real problem with China as a rival now, we would like you to stop trading with China. We would like you to stop selling them things that they can put in weapon systems. My suspicion is that our European partners will say, I'm sorry, I have a meeting with the Chinese trade minister in 20 minutes, because China is such a powerful economic force in ways that the Soviet Union, of course, never was. So again, NATO has been a wonderful alliance for a long, long time, but I fear it may no longer be of nearly the same relevance in the next century.
So,
Eva?
I'd agree 80%, but on the 20% disagreement is probably pretty important. So I do agree that the next, in fact, not the next, the existing real challenge that we face is a rising China. They are trying to reshape the world in a way that is beneficial to their interests, and it's not obvious that that is by definition beneficial to our interest. And that's what great powers do, and it's not that they're bad and they need to stop it, that's what they do. And we need to find a way to oppose the shaping of the order in a way that benefits them and doesn't benefit us, and there may be areas where we can cooperate. And so I also agree that our Asian alliance systems are rising in importance, and to think really strategically about how we engage with South Korea and Japan, with Australia, which, by the way, on all three we're losing, and India, are really important questions and deserve far more attention in our public debates and in our internal strategic debates in government and outside of government than we have. So far, totally in agreement. I do think that this is a global competition. And Europe is part of the object of that competition. The Chinese own the port in Athens today. It's their last stop on the OBOR, the One Belt, One Road initiative. The Chinese have something called 16+1 talks, 16 East European countries and and China to talk about economic and other means of cooperation. The EU today is actually debating an investment pact that would limit what the Chinese can invest in because of the strategic industries that Europe has that they don't want to sell to the Chinese. In fact, the Europeans understand there's a strategic game on. The Europeans look at this, are more likely to look at this in a way that is conducive to our interest if we can be partners on this. NATO is not the best organizational means to that end, although it happens to be the only organization where the United States and Europe talk to each other in an organizational setting. We could find something else to do that. But I actually think that Europe must be, and not only can be, but must be, a partner in the global competition, which hopefully will not be military, but it will be strategic, with China on these kinds of issues. And I wouldn't just dismiss it and say they're not important. No, I actually think as an economic marketplace, as an economic power, they could be a essential part in our attempt to conduct that competition. Again, I don't think NATO as a military organization is going to be crucial in that. As a political forum for having these kinds of discussions, it might offer a possibility. And indeed, when I was at NATO, we had discussions about China and how to deal with China quite regularly. The US-EU summits and meetings are very much focused on this today, particularly, again, on the investment and trade areas. Admittedly, the current relationship that the United States has with its allies, both in Asia and Europe, are not making this any easier, but I would argue that we would do well not to just dismiss Europe, say it's only about Asia, because I do think it's a global competition in which Europe can play a part and should play a part.
One quick point, I fully agree with that, and I think that we saw that played out in the Obama administration's so-called pivot to Asia, which in some way, with the redirection of resources, diplomatic and otherwise, kind of left a bit of a vacuum. Maybe you disagree with that, but it's certainly what I observed.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I think the problem with the pivot was not that we pivoted away from Europe, but that we didn't pivot away from the Middle East. That's probably Barry and I and Steve would have more agreement on. Actually, I think we didn't pivot away from Europe. We had too much concentration in the Middle East. And if we think about where our diplomatic, particularly our diplomatic, but also our military resources ought to be concentrated, I put Asia second, Asia first, Europe second, and the Middle East third. We have had now for the last 15 years a situation where Middle East has been number one, Asia and Europe competing for number 2 and 3, and I think we need to switch that around.
Yeah, but it's one thing that's worth remembering is that embedded in the concept of pivot is the concept of scarcity. The whole reason you need to pivot is because you can't do 2 or 3 or 4 things at once. You can concentrate on one thing or two things or another thing, but not everything, and that's because our resources are scarce. And they're scarce relative to the problems that maybe we all agree we face, and they're scarce relative to problems that are elective, right? And the question is, as the problems that maybe all of us agree we face grow more difficult because those states, such as China, grow more powerful, right, then the need for us to be much more rigorous in how we allocate our resources, on which causes we take up, becomes central, right? And you can back away from other causes because you think they're pointless, futile, or you could back away from other causes which you think those causes are at a point where they can defend themselves, right? And I think part of my argument is that the European cause on the security side is one we can afford to back away from because I believe they could defend themselves. And as long as we keep saying that we're going to defend them, they're going to do less to defend themselves.
Let's take another question from the audience.
Actually, we're going to take a quick pause from the questions and have our fact checker answer what
we've posed some questions of fact.
Okay. Earlier, there was a disagreement about how much of Germany's GDP was spent on military, and I've forgotten exactly what the question was, but just for the audience too, currently it's 1.2% of their GDP is spent on the military. That's from the World Bank and Deutsche Welle, and it's been under 2% since 1992. And there was another question about earlier when you were discussing Georgia and the expansion of NATO. Someone said that Georgia doesn't have a border with any NATO country. In fact, it does have a 100-mile border with Turkey.
Well, good thing we have a fact checker here.
That one you need to look up again.
Which one?
I don't think that's correct.
About Germany?
No, no. Germany totally agree on Georgia.
Yeah,
Georgia
sure
does not have a border with Turkey.
I'd have to look again.
I just looked on Google Maps, but it's
Then look at a different map.
maybe I'll look at a different map.
You've heard of fake news. We now have fake geography.
Well, it sounds like we've never needed to invoke a fact checker for our fact checker before, but we'll check.
Unless something has happened in the geography that it didn't know. Maybe Armenia has become part of Turkey. But
this is a rapidly
It's next
changing
to
time.
what's the country? Ossetia, which was
no.
not Ossetia, but the country just to the west of that. Let me tell you.
All right. Well, let's.
I think we can all Google this one.
Yes.
All right. My basic point is you should not be committed to fight and die for countries that you can't even locate on the map.
Even using Google Maps. Do we have another question from the audience ready to go?
We do have.
Over in the back,
I think we're going to move to our Facebook.
Yeah,
right?
actually, we have a. If this question is any indication, there is a very healthy discussion going on Facebook Live. So, Colleen, thank you for snagging this one. This is a good one. It goes back to Russia, so I think it probably goes to the fact that as Americans, we're worried about Russia, I think, but China maybe we should be. But this question is from Nicholas, and it says, does Russia benefit more from spending money on an overt military force, or is it more efficient for them to invest their money in covert operations to destroy the democratic nations of NATO?
So the question is, how does Russia better spend its money?
Yeah, well, that's for Russia to decide. My problem is they're doing both. And I think they are, although they're certainly not at the level that were as the Soviet Union and won't be, they are a revisionist power. They are interested in advancing their capacity, their influence, their power in two ways, overtly and covertly. Overtly, they're doing it in places like Crimea and other parts of eastern Ukraine. They are conducting the kinds of military exercises that are deeply troubling and dangerous. They fly their airplanes wingtip to wingtip without transponders around the Baltic and Black Seas and other places. They deploy submarines into the harbors of so-called neutral countries like Sweden. They engage in overflights of our ships that can risk the possibility of accidents and escalation, and those are overt means. And covertly, they're engaged in the kinds of activities we talked about with regard to the elections, which is a multifaceted. Some of it has to do with the exploitation of our own vulnerabilities, as Steve rightly pointed out. Others are a little bit more sophisticated in the cyber realm through hacking and other penetrations. The Department of Homeland Security has publicly stated that 21 electoral commissions of 21 states were penetrated by the Russians, looking at voter registration rolls and what have you. That is the essence of the core of our democracy, was attacked covertly in this way. Whether that influenced the outcome of the election is a completely different conversation. I'm not willing to go there. What I am willing to say is that they were trying to affect and have an impact on what is our electoral system, and they've done the same. Now we know with Brexit. They did the same in Catalonia with regard to the independence referendum there. They're deeply involved. They were deeply involved in the French and German systems. They tried to penetrate the Dutch electoral system, and there are worries about their penetration in Italy. All of that is designed to create doubts about a democracy, and it's working, by the way, and the strength and unity of our countries. It's all for the same reason. They are wanting to create influence. They're doing it with every means possible, and it's something that is not in our interest for them to succeed.
You want to jump in here, Nina?
Yeah, just one quick clarification on the penetration of electoral systems, because this is something that I think the media often get wrong about this. And Ivo, you explained it perfectly, but I think it's important to just be clear. Although the Russians penetrated voter rolls, there was no evidence so far of any vote tallies being changed, and that's extremely important to point out. To the point of the question, I would absolutely agree that Russia gets a lot of bang for its buck on these information operations. $100,000 worth of ads on Facebook were purchased. We don't know the engagement rates on those ads, but wow, they've created a lot of doubt and certainly a lot of dismay in our democracy about the discourse that we're having, and that's exactly what they want. They just want to create this disarray, and it's not only around elections, it's about the conversation that we're having. They want to pull people apart, and in that way, yeah, $100,000 has really significantly altered the way we think about what happened in 2016.
I want to ask a question about something that we've alluded to, but I don't know that we've really confronted directly. One of the things, all of you have some quibbles or concerns about how effective NATO has been in various ways, but I think you'd also all agree that it has been, over the long term, a generally stable and stabilizing institution over its nearly 70 years. We're living in this time when things don't seem very stable, globally and here in the United States. I mean, we've put President Trump's name in the title of this event, and there are many who would suggest that United States leadership in the world is threatened in a way it hasn't been in generations. Stephen, you spent one of your weekly columns in Foreign Policy last month drawing extensive parallels between President Trump and Kaiser Wilhelm II, who led Germany into World War I. All this to say, isn't the stability, the collaboration, the steadiness of NATO not only a good thing, but an especially important thing at a time like this? And I've invoked.
It's a
go
leading
ahead.
question. I'll take it.
Well, and I happen to know you have different answers to that question. But go ahead.
I mean, first of all, I do think we need to recognize the degree to which our leadership is being challenged, mainly because of our own behavior. Take what happened today. President Trump has, through his recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, united the world, unfortunately against the United States rather than in favor of the United States, which is not exactly what leadership is about. The doubt that he has raised with our allies about the U.S. commitment for NATO, a doubt that's unique. No time since 1949 has any European country truly doubted America's commitment to collective defense in Europe. They do now. I can tell you that there are very senior leaders and officials in NATO countries who doubt that if the challenge were to come and an attack were to occur, that the United States would necessarily be there. That's different. That may, and that uncertainty may, on the one hand, create an incentive to do more together within Europe, to do more on enhancing Europe's own capacity for defense, and that would be salutary. And it may also divide Europe. It may also lead people to say, well, if we can't trust the United States, then maybe we should find ways in which we can avoid the possibility of conflict by not deterrence, but appeasement. And there are debates in every European country about the direction in which the foreign policy of these countries should go. It's not in our interest, I would argue, for those divisions to grow and to manifest themselves in the division within, not only within countries, but between European countries, let alone a division that would divide Europe once again, somewhere between East and West. And so tinkering with something that has worked for a very long time should be done very carefully. Doesn't mean we can't change. I'm all in favor of trying to figure out how we can do the bargain on European defense, in which the burden is shared in a way that reflects 2017 economic, political, and strategic conditions rather than 1949 political and economic conditions. I'm all in favor of that. But thinking through how we do that is important, and we don't do it in a way that is so disruptive and makes so many challenges to the core of the system without knowing where we're going to end on the other side. And I'm afraid that the way we've been doing it in the last 10 months is enhancing the prospect of that disruption rather than enhancing the prospect of a renewed bargain that gets us to the place that we all wanted to get to.
I think there's another way of looking at this, and that is it really a stable world when so many lean on the United States and so many run around like chickens with their heads cut off when we have an unusual election that elects an unusual president who pursues unusual policies, right? I would feel much more comfortable right now about the state of the world had the North Atlantic Treaty Organization made a serious effort to reform itself 10 or 12 or 15 years ago. I'd feel a lot better if many of the security jobs that NATO performs had been incrementally passed to the European Union, starting after the Kosovo War, when important European powers began to realize that the situation was not exactly right. In a weird way, in our effort to create a stable world order managed by us, we've created a fragile world order that's way too dependent on us doing the right things. Now, it's very hard for any great power, any strategist to say, I want to armor the world against me. So I'm not proposing that some sagacious American statesman should understand that. I'm just making an observation about the irony of this situation.
I want to, not surprisingly, I want to pick up on that. I mean, the classic phrase from the 1990s was Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's famous remark, for which he took enormous heat, that the United States is the indispensable power that sees farther than others do. Not exactly a flattering way of talking to your diplomatic counterparts, but it captured, I think, very much the way our foreign policy elite tends to think about its role and has thought about its role for a long time, especially since victory in the Cold War. Suddenly, the United States had the magic formula for running the world. You had to become a lot more like the United States. You had to participate in a globalized world economy. You had to have democracy. You had to have rule of law. You had to be in an American-led institution, or better yet, several of them. We would, of course, run those institutions, manage them with a little bit of help and participation from others, but we were the indispensable power. Right? Now, this has not gone particularly well over the last 25 years. Most of the big projects we took on, whether in the Middle East or I would argue in Eastern Europe, did not pan out the way we hoped they would, sometimes in worse shape or not. But it really just sort of captures, I think, the point Barry was trying to make, that we did create a structure where it was kind of dependent on us doing all the leading. And Donald Trump is clearly, shaking that structure quite visibly. And I think Ivo and all four of us would all agree that even if you fervently believe that NATO had to be radically reformed and maybe even slowly taken out of existence, this is not the way to do it. You would want to do it in a careful, disciplined, friendly, amicable, friendly divorce, not rancorous one. So we agree on that one. I'll just add one final point is, it is also worth asking whether or not the chief political problems that Europe faces are ones for which NATO is really the relevant solution, right? As I look at the future of Europe, it's basically the future of the European economy and the European Union, particularly in light of Brexit, and dealing with the refugee problem and all of the political consequences that then has subsequently had within Europe, rise of ethno-nationalism of different kinds. And that problem is not going to go away for Europe, right? Even if the Syrian civil war ends and the things settle down in other parts of the Middle East, because there's a very large sub-Saharan population that's very young, that doesn't have economic opportunities, and is traveling already to try and get to Europe and will continue to try and do that. And this is going to be a challenge for the Europeans to deal with, but NATO is not the instrument for dealing with it. So as I look forward at Europe's problems, I don't think NATO is really the answer. That's in part because I have a more muted view of what I think the Russian challenge is. It's a problem. I don't think Russia wants to reincorporate Eastern Europe. They couldn't run it if they tried, etc. But nonetheless, my point is here simply that NATO is an institution that was a great institution for its time, but we ought to be imaginative in looking forward, and if the world is unstable now, we want to manage that instability to come up with structures that make sense for the world we're heading into, not the world that no longer exists.
Nina, do you want to add anything?
Everyone's made a lot of good points. I mean, the thing that I keep coming back to is that, talking about stability, most Europeans, and certainly the newer members, not all, Slovakia is the exception, have a very favorable view of NATO and view it as not a threat and an integral key to protection and stability in Europe. And I agree with your original point that if we want that stability, it's something that we shouldn't tinker with at this moment.
Let's take one last question from the audience.
We actually have a concerned citizen from Kansas in the audience. Dr. Kuhn has a question for you.
Yeah, John Kuhn. I teach at Fort Leavenworth. Yeah, you guys have brought it all the way back, so I'm gonna modify this question and make it real short. We've talked a lot about NATO. That's where it starts. Does the United States have to be in NATO? In other words, is NATO still a good idea with a much smaller role or even absent the United States? And I would pose the question to Professor Posen first.
Well, I don't like to prejudge the ultimate arrangement. I would like us to at least have a conversation about a range of arrangements. One would be, as we've talked about, the enduring fantasy of better burden sharing. There was one time where we had pretty good traction on that. Not perfect, but in the late 70s and early 80s, there was something called the NATO Long-Term Defense Program. And it required enormous energy to make that work. It didn't work perfectly, but it did produce some success. But it took enormous political energy. And it also took a kind of a threat in the background that if the Europeans didn't pony up, the American Congress was going to begin to turn against the alliance, because there had been that debate in Congress, right, under Senator Mansfield. So that would be ratcheting up, you know, one dial setting or one possible option. A second option would be handing the keys to the NATO military structure to whomever in Western Europe wants it, right, and returning the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to the political alliance that I believe it was originally conceived to be. In other words, originally there wasn't supposed to be a military structure. It was not imagined. That came after the Soviet threat began to appear quite imminent. So one could imagine a transatlantic alliance that was a political alliance of the old-fashioned type, where two parties agree to help each other under certain circumstances, but there is not an extant military structure that manages it, right? Now, the European Union has flirted with many military structures, and we've quelched them whenever they've tried, because we insist that NATO's the big dog and they shouldn't be in this game. It's entirely possible with that that beautiful new building built across the street from the old rattletrap NATO that he worked in, right, that if you handed the keys to that beautiful new building to the European Union and said you could have a command structure here, we're actually leaving, that they might decide to keep that command structure. That would be another possibility. A third possibility is that we have a date certain. We say, over the next 10 years, the entire superstructure of NATO will be dissolved, right, political and military, and we will achieve some other kind of political relationship, but it'll be a zero-based renegotiation of what that relationship will be between the European Union, say, as an institution of some kind, and the United States as what the United States is. So one could imagine 3 or 4 different options, right? And different people would favor different ones. But to me, the important thing is to ask the question of whether the present situation is necessary and sustainable, right? I think it is not necessary, it is not sustainable, and we need a serious consideration, not just among ourselves, but in Europe, which they're doing now for, as Ivo said, under the exact wrong circumstances, for what alternative arrangements should be. I do have this hypothesis rattling around my head that this degree of interlocking relationship between us and the Europeans, right, is not resilient, right? It's not resilient to tempests that sometimes sweep the politics of their countries or ours. And we always assume it's not going to be ours. But our country is facing a political tempest. And I think we should be a little bit humble here, right? We shouldn't put too much of this on the back of President Trump. The fact is, he contrived to win the election, right? He didn't win as many votes, but he did contrive to win the election. And the fact that a person with that message can win the election, right, tells you something about the political divisions in this country, right? So it's just not clear to me, given that lesson, that other countries who've had this relationship that Ivo talked about in the past with us should really count on having it again in what remains of my lifetime or in the next several lifetimes. There has been a kind of a sea change. At least that's a hypothesis. And given that sea change, some different kinds of security arrangements may be smarter, better, safer.
We're almost out of time. Can we leave that there? Let me turn then to our final question, and I think Ambassador Katz explained this just before we all came out. There's a new American Public Square tradition. We're wrapping up each event asking our panelists to answer 2 simple questions. So what? And now what? And it's intended that your answer to the so what question is the length of a tweet.
Which
Thankfully, Twitter has doubled the length of tweets now to 280 characters, so you're okay.
Still pretty short.
Yeah, but still pretty short, that is correct. A sentence or 2 summarizing sort of what you shared here tonight and why this matters. And then the second part of that question is, you know, in the belief that this isn't just supposed to be an arcane academic discussion, but to lead to some sort of action, something that matters for people's lives. What do you want people here to do about it? So what and now what? And now we'll go across the stage here. Ivo?
America's security and Europe's security are continue to be sufficiently intertwined that an organization like NATO is necessary for the foreseeable future. That's a so what. It is about the intertwining of that relationship. What next is we do have to have a serious debate, which we will have in part because of the President's
Okay, I found 14 appointments.
You really You have 14 appointments.
14 appointments.
Siri.
That's the
My
Russians,
goodness.
by the way.
Yeah.
Siri
It's a busy day.
is serious.
He said Siri. He said serious, and that yeah, that's
Somehow
good.
my serious pronunciation is like Siri. Should we do that again?
That was excellent. No.
We are having a serious debate about burden sharing. It's a necessary debate. It would be good to have that kind of debate in the way we had it in the late 70s and the 80s, as Barry said, because we need to reset the bargain. The trick is doing so in a way that doesn't raise prematurely or without much thought the entire questions about the entire infrastructure. That's the hard part, but the need to do that is important.
Barry Posen. So what and now what?
Well, the so what is, it's in the Europeans' interest to muscle up, right? And it's in our interest that they muscle up. So it's time for them to muscle up. This is the same message I gave at a meeting I was at in Brussels a few months ago. Time for Europeans to muscle up. As far as what people should do as, in leaving this meeting and in the future, you're going to hear from your congresspersons and also from the president an argument in the coming months and years that the United States needs to significantly increase its spending on national defense. This is despite the fact that we already spend not only more than anyone else, but more than almost everyone else put together. This is the argument you're going to hear, right? And one question you should ask your elected officials is, all these countries that you're proposing that we double down on defending and that we reach into our pockets, right, in order to make them feel more secure, how rich are those countries and what are they doing to defend themselves? Before we do more, we should know that they are doing more. We should not care more about their security and their freedom than they care about their security and their freedom.
Thank you. Nina Jancowitz. So what and now what?
So what? I would agree with everything Ivo said and add on that NATO is also about values, and these values are worth standing up for. This is what our country was founded on, and we should continue to do that. Now what? This is a little bit of a media literacy and critical thinking exercise, but you're all here, you care about these issues. Go forth and talk to people about them. How many of your neighbors know what NATO actually does? Have a conversation.
And Stephen Walt. So what and now what?
So what, the proper way to judge any sort of foreign policies, does it make the United States safer? Does it make the United States more prosperous? And that's the benchmark by which you have to judge different proposals. Going forward with respect to NATO, I would say just that we have to, I think, be much more imaginative. Just because something worked well for a particular set of circumstances doesn't mean it's a fit for purpose in very different circumstances. In terms of the now what, I'll echo what Nina said in a slightly different way. I would say, regardless of who you found more persuasive here, or maybe none of us, at some point in the next year, perform at least one act of direct political participation. Call a congressman's office, call a senator's office. They actually pay attention to such things. Write a letter to your local paper. Phone in to an NPR talk-in show and berate the moderator.
Please.
Or the guest.
Whatever it is, do at least one act of political participation. Make your particular views known to others.
Let's thank our guests, Ivo DAALDER, Barry Posen, Nina Jancowitz, and Stephen Waltz.
Thank you.